like to call to order this meeting of the Raleigh City Council. Everybody's on the phone. Mr. Thompson is absent and excused, and I'm assuming the other two will be here shortly, but we'll go ahead and get going.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. This is the second work session on Dorothea Dix Park. There's no action today. We'll have another work session at a future meeting. The purpose is to continue to go through the implementation of Phase 1. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the feasibility and engineering and process studies are necessary to help move that forward, as well as community engagement. So with that, Kate Pierce from Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources here to make a presentation.
All right, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. It's good to see everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Not afternoon yet.
It all runs together.
So as Ruffin mentioned, this is a series of discussions building on your direction to develop an implementation plan for the first phase of project work for Dix Park. Last week, we reviewed a lot of the projects and the Conservancy's proposal to pull some of those forward. And this week, we will discuss the plans and studies that help us determine the feasibility of that work. As Ruffin mentioned, we will come back to you hopefully in future work sessions to address some of the things that were brought up last week but won't be directly addressed in this meeting, which is the committee structure that potentially will govern the future of the park, staffing options, and also firm procurement to help manage some of these studies. Today's agenda will be focusing on the supporting plans and studies needed to move forward on Phase 1 projects, and to take a little bit of a step back, review what worked well during the community outreach and engagement for the master plan, and how we've used some of those lessons learned to inform our strategy moving forward. Just as a reminder, there are 7 projects in the first phase of work, and each of these projects speak to the core principles of the master plan, which are to open up and connect the park to the greater community, build from the natural and cultural assets that exist today, and really be a place for everyone. Over the past few months, staff has spent a lot of time looking at the details of these projects to determine the feasibility of how the projects can move forward. So we've identified a scope of work, or multiple scopes of work, that help determine the feasibility of Phase 1 projects, ensure that the city is being a good steward of our assets, to address some of the issues that were brought up during the planning process but not resolved, and ultimately to set the project up for future success. And all of this is really in purpose to move from planning to implementation. So we set this bold, ambitious vision in the master plan. We need to understand the feasibility of that vision to then move into design and construction of the Phase 1 projects. So the first I wanted to bring up is the Dorothea Dix Equity Plan. And this is really an effort to build on a recommendation from the advisory committee to make sure that we always are looking through the park's development through the lens of equity. It also is going to align with the broader city effort that's being led by Dr. Caesar and her office, and potentially be a pilot project for future park planning opportunities. If we think about the equity plan, it has a lot of practical implications. So for example, do we think about economic opportunity in the park, and what does it look like from a workforce development or training? Do we think about accessibility, universal design, so people of all abilities are able to enjoy the park? So all of these pillars will be parts of the equity plan moving forward. It also is an accountability tool for us. So it'll be the checklist that we continue to come back to as the park develops to ensure that we are holding true to the intention of being a place for everyone. And so that study will be something that we would like to kind of kick off in the next few months to align also with the work that the EDGE study is doing as part of the planning department's scope of work. And I'm happy to answer any questions right now or come back to them at the end of the discussion. Another study that has already started is the North Carolina Department of Transportation Access Study. This is an in-kind donation of services to the city to develop concept-level designs and cost estimates for improvements to state-maintained roads around the park. And so to put a finer point on it, we have this really detailed map that shows the state-maintained roads around the park. That includes Centennial Parkway, Western Boulevard, and parts of Lake Wheeler Road. And so the idea with this access study is actually to identify hotspots where the state can bring some design and cost estimates. So for example, they're looking at the feasibility of the land bridge. They're looking at the feasibility of potentially altering the interchange at I-40. They're looking at the feasibility of an intersection improvement at South Boylan Avenue and Western Boulevard. So these are all state-maintained roads that the state, in partnership with the city, is going to look at improvements that can improve traffic flow not only to Dix Park, but in this area of Raleigh. That study has just kicked off, and so when there is a substantial update, we'd be happy to bring that back to you for consideration. The other piece on the kind of non-auto side of things is the idea of additional bike and pedestrian connections to the park. This builds off recommendations in the master plan that talked about how are we going to connect to other city destinations, such as downtown. It will align with ongoing work with the Western Boulevard Corridor Study, the NCDOT Access Study, and the Greenway Master Plan update. But thinking about how we get bikes and pedestrians from other destinations in the city to the park, and just build off the kind of the vision of the master plan, but bringing that more into implementation with this additional piece of work. The other piece that I wanted to spend a bit of time on, because it's the most complex and potentially longest term project in the whole suite of phase one, is the creek and landfill feasibility study. So we have this amazing vision for the future of the creek. We want to reestablish the meander. We want to remove landfill. We want to create a waterfront destination in the heart of the park. But there are a lot of unanswered questions on how we're actually going to do that. So the creek and landfill feasibility study, in partnership with the Department of Environmental Quality, is really getting to the questions of, can we do the vision, can we accomplish the vision that was set forth in the master plan? It will also require a lot of engagement with both stakeholders upstream and downstream, because water just doesn't stop at our edges, right? It flows through. So we're going to have a lot of conversations with both NC State Pullen Park and then private landowners south of Dix Park about the upstream and downstream impacts. And just as a reminder, the vision of the creek really is to take a channel that is very steep today and open it up into a much wider floodplain that creates this great public amenity on the frontage of the park. It includes things like removing part of a landfill, reestablishing the hydrology of the system, and it's going to require a lot of technical analysis to understand if we're able to do that. So we want to look at both the scale and scope of the project through things like soil borings and flow testing to really understand if we're able to restore that historic creek channel. We also, in follow-up to your question last week, Councilmember Stewart, want to look at the landfill waste options. So we don't really have a great understanding of what's all in that landfill, nor do we understand the depth of the waste. So we have to understand those pieces to move forward on if we're able to remove some of the landfill, where does it go, how is it repurposed, and can we establish that creek channel? This piece of the work is so critical to get going sooner rather than later because it has such an extended time frame compared to other projects within phase one. It also is an important thing for, I think, council members to know that the Department of Environmental Quality has stepped forward with a lot of their departmental agency representation to help us think about the implementation of this piece specifically, seeing that they'll be one of the regulatory entities permitting the project on the back end. So I think that's a good piece for us to move forward. In addition to the creek project, there were a bit of questions around the infrastructure master plan last week, both from Councilmember Branch and Councilwoman Crowder. We need to have basically an understanding of what we have today. So we don't know where all of the sewer lines are. We don't know where the gas lines are. And so we need to document the facility that we have today and have a better understanding of those infrastructure pieces, and then plan for what we need in phase one. So we do want to take a look at what are the elements that we need to support phase one projects, and then also set up the project for future success. So maybe it's defining priorities and criteria for future consideration, but this will focus on two major things. One, understand what we have today, and two, what will we need to update and or change to support phase one projects. And then as a back-end piece, define some criteria that will help set us up for future success when we think about longer-term impacts, for example, the buildings and the steam infrastructure that serves those 85 buildings. So we're not trying to make those decisions specific to that today, but set us up for those future successes. This scope of work has been something that we've been talking a lot about with our internal partners, with public utilities and stormwater, to really get a good grasp of making sure that the amount of money we invest today is actually, I think the reference was that the juice is worth the squeeze on a lot of this, because it's a lot of acreage to understand. In addition to the infrastructure study, we are looking at further analysis of some of the early buildings that were transferred to the city from the state. So you might recall that Stephen, a few months ago, presented on 13 structures that were transferred to the city. And there was a number of things that we need to answer. First, we're testing all of those buildings for asbestos and lead paint. We can pretty confidently say yes, that is all there. But how do we actually remediate those structures, both if they are going to be demolished or if they're going to be repurposed? We still have to have that base set of information to move forward. The other piece is for the buildings that are proposed to remain, which the decision isn't made that all of those will remain, we need to have a better understanding of their feasibility. So are they structurally sound? Could they even be repurposed if we wanted them to be repurposed? So again, it's gathering that information as the owner of the property to support the due diligence to move into the phase 1 projects. There's also a big understanding here that this campus was maintained for 150 years by the Department of Health and Human Services and the state. So it is not up to city standard today. So what do we need to do, and how will we accomplish, if we are bringing some of these buildings up to code, that we are meeting our own standards that we have set for the city? And so all of that work has started to determine the feasibility of the early buildings as we move forward. It will also help, I should be mindful, with refinement of potential cost estimates and proposals so that we're able to make an informed decision on those structures. The last piece that I just wanted to touch on the early studies is an analysis of our existing zoning and development codes pertaining to park development. So today the campus is zoned, and what will be the district that will allow for phase 1 park development moving forward? Is there an incremental way to think about the zoning of the property to facilitate the implementation of the master plan? And so working with long-term planning and development services, we'll not only want to look at our zoning code, but also the rest of our city codes to make sure that we're not only holding ourselves accountable to what we've set forth, but also thinking creatively about how we can accomplish a project like this where our codes might not necessarily be set up to support a project like this. There are also some things like including the Dorothea Dix Master Plan as part of the 2030 Comprehensive Plan. That's kind of standard process for a plan once it's adopted by City Council. This is really going to help us understand not only how we can move some of those phase now projects forward, which the Conservancy we talked about last week, but also the longer term implication of how we move the project through our regulatory framework. So I want to also mention, in addition to all of that, there are a number of ongoing efforts that directly impact the park's development. So I think a lot of you are familiar with the Western Boulevard Corridor study and the EDGE study that was talked about a lot last week, but there is a need for close coordination among all of these efforts to ensure an efficient, coordinated approach to city building in this area of Raleigh. So not only are we thinking about the park impacts or the park studies, but what are all these ancillary projects that have an impact in this area of Raleigh? And how do we make sure not only are we coordinated from a technical perspective, but how are we coordinated from a community engagement perspective? Because all of those 9 studies that I just listed, plus the 7 studies that are listed here, that is a lot of work going on, and we want to make sure the community has a good understanding of all of the efforts that the city is making to improve facility in this area of Raleigh. So for instance, the Dix Edge study, which we talked about, There is the Western Boulevard Corridor study, the BRT planning study. All of these things have overlapping components, and we just want to make sure we're extremely coordinated as each of these move forward to ensure the community knows what's going on, and also that council has the information it needs to make an informed decision about all of these efforts. Here you can see just a generic, or not generic, a timeline of when we expect those studies to kick off and/or the ones that have already been completed. So I want to pause here because that's a lot of information at a very high level. You do have kind of a lovely little briefing book in front of you that highlights the projects that we talked about last week, but also provides a little bit of more scope of work relevant to the plans and studies that we envision moving forward. And so this is just kind of a cheat sheet for you to understand everything we talked about last week and the plans and studies that I just went through fairly quickly. But I'd like to pause here and go back to any of those efforts and see if you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns about the work that we're planning to do.
Could you go back to the land bridge one?
Sure. The transportation or the creek?
That one.
This one, yes.
That one. I just needed one more moment to look at it.
Yeah, of course.
Went by quickly. Okay, so we're in conversations with NCDOT as it relates to that land bridge.
Yes.
Excellent, good work,
Thank you.
good work.
How, the boundary for the landfill,
Yes.
how big is it? Do we actually
Yeah,
know?
so the landfill is about 53 acres, so it's a significant portion of that area of the park. When the state was going through kind of due diligence, they did do soil borings to mark the extent of the landfill. So we know where the landfill boundary is, but we don't know, for instance, how deep it is where we want to, for instance, build this oxbow in the creek. And so that's where we need that additional level of work to understand that piece of it.
Okay. And how big is the cemetery?
The cemetery, Grace, what? 3 acres. And so we did do ground penetrating radar to understand the boundary of the cemetery. And actually the fence line that's out there today does not include the full extent of the cemetery. Okay. So that'll be one of the early things that we want to do to make sure that is a final resting place that is clearly demarcated from the rest of the park.
Okay. So are all the barriers, all of them marked or not?
No, so that's a good question. The cemetery is, it was an active cemetery, it was a place people were buried from 1859 to 1970, and not all of those grave sites are marked. There are a series of plaques on the ground that a volunteer project installed, but we unfortunately do not know who is buried where in the entire extent of the cemetery, and probably the state just did not keep those records. But what we can do is ensure that as the park develops around the cemetery, we bring in interpretive signage and kind of really make sure that that sacred place is honored in the future of the park.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Can you go to the parallel planning efforts slide, that one?
Oop.
Just curious what the red markings are?
Yeah, where is the legend to that map? We'd be happy to provide that to you. But so the hatch area is the Southern Gateway study. The red is the extent of the Dix Edge study area. The red dots are potential hotspots that DOT will look at in their DOT access study. The legend was a little too small on this, but we'd be happy to provide that to you. And I think it's in your packet, as you can see that.
But those are areas of particular interaction with DOT.
Correct. So the little rectangle, is the land bridge. And then here is the entrance at South Boylan Avenue. So these are the potential hotspots we identified in the DOT access study, but more might come up through that planning effort.
So
Russ, could you use your microphone?
referring back to this map, if it helps, on the timeline, there's a discussion of pull into Bain water main.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, can you kind of sketch out where the alignment of that?
So there is not a proposed alignment yet. There are 3 options that are being evaluated by PUD. And so, but the idea is that we need a water main to duplicate the service from the pull-in plant to Bain. And so, one option they're looking at here, one option they're looking at here, and then one goes through the park. And they're kind of evaluating the feasibility of those alignments to provide that additional water service. And there's potential for some benefits to the park itself with that line.
So those will be gravity lines?
Do any of our friends?
I mean, there's a lot of topography there.
Yes, there is a
So-
lot of topography there. I can follow up with public utilities and get some of that specific information for you.
So I would have just guessed they would have paralleled some of the existing right-of-ways, but looks like not. Okay, all right. Okay, and then obviously from Lake Wheeler, it's got to get on over to Bain, which is another hike, but that's kind of
Correct,
outside your
yeah.
scope. Okay, all right.
Thanks.
Yep. Any other questions about this set of studies? You'll notice that we did not bring costs of the studies or how we intend to cover those costs, and that will be a point of discussion at a future work session. So the other piece I wanted to shift gears to is to talk about community outreach and engagement. One is during the master plan process, we held a very broad but not very deep engagement process. And what I mean by that is we were looking to talk to the community about their vision for the future of the park. We did have a multi-tiered committee structure, but there were a lot of lessons learned from that process that included needing to clearly define the roles and responsibilities between the two committees to continue to address gaps in our underrepresented communities in the planning process. One of the ones that I think continued to come up was maximizing the expertise of our volunteers. So there's a lot of people that have a lot of knowledge that could potentially benefit the park planning process. We also know that we needed to enhance the feedback loop so that people understand where their comments are going and how those are directly impacting the planning effort, and to recognize and utilize the expertise of existing established groups and groups not only within the city but also community-based groups. So with that, we propose kind of a shift in the way we're thinking about outreach and engagement. One is we want to continue to build general awareness with the community about the park. And that might be something that our partners with the Dix Park Conservancy can help us with. The second is we want to shift to having more targeted and specific conversations about the Phase 1 projects. So for example, if we're moving into the creek design, we need to bring together a group of natural resource experts. We need to bring together a group of utility experts to help us think through the specifics to the Phase 1 projects. And this is intended to really pay attention to our community groups that have a lot of not only interest but expertise that can help move this project forward, specific to the Phase 1 projects. And so what you see here is a potential way that this could work. And so it speaks to Councilmember Mendel during the discussion last week. You mentioned kind of the 0% meeting. And so as we move into design, there's going to be multiple opportunities to include a variety or universe of stakeholders, but we want to be much more targeted with those stakeholder groups. So for example, we know that there are a lot of partners on the agency side that are going to help us move this project forward. Having focused discussions with those project partners at key milestones through the design process is something that we're going to be very intentional about. In addition, we know that there is this whole constellation of community groups and individuals and organizations, and I know it's hard to see, but you do have this copy in your book as well, that want to be involved in the planning of this. So everything from the Wake Nature Preserve to Partners for Environmental Justice on the environment and natural resources side. How do they want to be involved in planning the future of these Phase 1 projects? And so from a city perspective, in Phase 1 project delivery, we're going to be very intentional about including the right groups at the right time to get their feedback on the projects as they move forward. Now, this is independent of what we believe is also critical, important to keep going, which is continuing to build awareness and interest in the vision for the future of Dix Park. And this might be an opportunity where we rely on our friends at the Conservancy to help us at community events, at our movies, just to continue to ensure that all members of this community feel like they are a part of the future of Dix Park, and by providing clear opportunities through volunteerism and other means to provide people their opportunity to contribute to the future of Dix Park. So the city will be focused much more on project delivery for the Phase 1 projects, while we might look to other partnerships to help us with the general community building and community awareness building of the planning process. And so this is something that will not only be a component that will continue. So for example, making sure that we are present at all of the festivals and events, but also then we're having these very specific, very targeted conversations with the right people about how to move the Phase 1 projects forward. And so I want to pause here and talk about those two buckets, the project specific and then the general outreach and awareness building, and see if y'all have any questions or concerns about how we're kind of approaching those separately.
I think the main thing is, once all the stakeholder groups are identified, having those, make sure they have the right information and it's current as things move and evolve during the project, to make sure that the community is engaged and up to date, and we early on set what those checkpoints are.
Yeah.
I think that's critical. And then I think, once we, I see this list, and once we narrow down the checkpoints, just another set of eyes to look at it, double check.
Right.
We still don't have any gaps, and kind of go from there. But I think it's a good start.
What you'll notice is there's some blank bubbles on here, and the blank bubbles are intentionally there to understand. We don't know the entire kind of universe of stakeholders yet, but we need to do the work to do that, to understand those groups.
So I really do appreciate you going back and sort of doing a deep dive of what worked before and what we could have done better.
Right.
And then really structuring this, it seems, in a more meaningful way for those that are interested and those that have expertise. Because I think you've heard, as well as I heard, that people, especially around the university, who have a lot of knowledge in all kinds of environmental things, want to be a part of that and want to use their skill sets to help.
Yeah.
So I commend you for reaching out that way.
Okay, so now I've gone around, looked at all the bubbles. Is Governor Moorhead
Yes.
ever going to be on there?
Yeah.
Or have I missed that?
So if you look, this little bubble right here,
Oh, they're right in the center bubble.
yeah, because
Okay.
they're our direct neighbors. So the center bubbles are all of our direct neighbors. And the Governor Moorhead School, the Department of Administration, and the Department of Public Instruction will be critical for that land bridge piece.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that.
Thank you.
That's good.
So where we are is we've shown you the projects, the Phase 1 projects. We've kind of talked about how we intend to understand more about the feasibility of that work to push it forward. The next steps, we will come back to you with specific recommendations on how we might fund that project work. Also, we understand that we need to talk about how we're going to deliver those projects, so how we're going to acquire professional services to move forward. We also know that we need to revisit our committee structure and what should be the committee oversight for the projects as they move forward, as well as looking at how we're going to accomplish all of this as a city. So this is now, this is a city effort to create Dix Park. And so how will all departments respond to provide the staffing needed to move this project towards implementation? So all of that will be part of next steps discussions at future work sessions. But know those are things that are very top of mind for all of us as we're thinking about how to efficiently and effectively deliver this project work over the next few years. Potentially, we might be coming back to you. You're going to see a lot of us in October, but that might be the next time where we bring back some of this information for your discussion and review. So are there any additional questions or comments?
I just have a comment.
Yes.
Thank you for putting all this together and helping us understand just how many layers there are of this. Looking back at project stakeholders.
Yes.
And I'm just looking at the large number of community groups, everything from Boy and Girl Scouts to the Chamber and Arts and all of these. I think that it's more than just, having them represented and having a person from that group that provides input. I think
Right.
it's a great opportunity to reach out to all members of that group. I mean, you know, if it's, I've said this before, but, you know, if it's $5 and you get to be a charter member of whatever, and you get on the email list, and people feel like they're part of it. It's not an overwhelming expense, whatever. Just threw that number out there.
Yeah.
But I think I mean, you look at, you've got thousands of people all involved in these organizations, and that could be a great way to, you know, people want to contribute and they want to feel ownership in this. And so however that, I just think that going through this phase one is a great opportunity to use that. And
I think there
Get
are
people
two
connected.
pieces to that. One, it's a great opportunity for the Dix Park Conservancy to help us to continue to build that community of support. Two, a lot of these project partners and project stakeholders might actually help us with implementation of things on the back end. So building the partnership structures and engaging these groups early that might benefit the park and the city moving forward is a great way to do that.
okay, any other questions?
No, thank you. Good job.
All right, thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
We appreciate it. Anything else, Mr. Manager? Okay. See you back at 1.
Thank you.